Okay, welcome everybody. We here at OHD have had so much fun partnering with Osha for the Safe+Sound week. I want to thank you all so much for tuning in and welcome back if you happen to participate in the webinar on Monday. I'm Stephanie Lynch and I'm OHD's Industrial Hygiene Product Manager. And we have everyone muted to limit background noise. We do have that chat feature enabled. So feel free to shoot us messages there and we'll get to them as we're able. Justin is here monitoring things for me, safely distanced, of course. Say hello, Justin.
Hey, everybody.
And he can ask some of your questions as we go along. So feel free to ask.
Absolutely.
And I just want to start out by noting that I've been working in industrial hygiene for 15 years. And 15 years ago, we knew, actually for over 15 years, but for 15 years, we've known that, and longer, we've known that occupational noise exposure was harmful. And we knew that we needed to protect people from that exposure. Now we clearly still know this, and I believe that great progress has been made in the communication of noise as a hazard. But numbers have simply leveled out on what is a preventable work-related injury. Oh. There we go. Sorry, guys. So I think there are a few things that we all know. We all know someone who has or is suffering from hearing loss. I personally know many people with hearing loss, most of whom directly attribute this loss to their job, to exposures at the workplace. Although I will point out that part of that is sometimes a misunderstanding of what the risk is away from work. You know, we put a lot of focus on these exposures that happen in the workplace, and people can be less concerned with some of the exposures that they might receive in their personal lives or with hobbies that they have, you know, going to concerts or being avid hunters or shooters, things like that. I believe we also all recognize by now that loud noises can cause harm. And that when this noise happens to be continuous noise, that the length of time that we spend exposed to this loud noise impacts the amount of damage that we might receive. So because of these well-known things, noise exposure in the workplace is regulated. And so since we know all of this, it seems like we should have been seeing much more vast improvements or a steady decline, basically, in the amounts of work-related noise-induced hearing loss. So is noise still a problem? So according to the CDC, 22 million American workers are exposed to hazardous noise on the job. Niosh estimates that the economic impact of occupational noise-induced hearing loss in the US alone is more than $240 million per year. Even more importantly though, a hearing loss can degrade our connections to other people by negatively impacting our ability to both understand and to communicate. Can you imagine the impacts of that now in what may be our new normal? Because I struggle to hear people with their face coverings on and over Zoom, and I don't have problems with my hearing. It's just I've connected so much with being able to see people's mouths as they talk, and it's just inhibited my ability to kind of focus. So think about people who actually have that hearing loss, how that might be impacting them. So these are some noise exposure at work and its relationship to hearing loss that was found in adults. So this is the speech frequency hearing loss that's in both ears, so bilateral hearing loss. And the figure is showing the percentage of the US population from the age of 20 to 69 with speech frequency hearing loss. And the reason we're focused on speech frequency is because that's what our ears are geared to hear, and that's what's also most important to us as social beings. So the hearing loss is defined as when the average threshold across the 4 speech frequencies is greater than 25 decibels hearing level. So a loss of 25 decibels in that speech frequency range is something equal to some soft speech in a relatively quiet room. This is from a National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Anything that I cite in here, we'll send out the link for those resources in the follow-up email that we'll send out. So these are some more statistics just showing that we're still struggling with hearing loss in our society. And this directly relates back to that previous statistic. You're still going to see about 20% that are going to have that degree of hearing loss. And these are not necessarily noise exposed populations, so we don't know which percentage is associated with that based on these statistics, but you can still tell that hearing loss is a significant issue. And as I think moving forward, I mean, I would say we definitely still have a problem, but I would say moving forward, I see more and more people, particularly young people, with headphones in, and I wonder if they're even considering that exposure. It wouldn't shock me if moving forward we saw more and more young people who are experiencing some hearing loss. I've had several occasions back when you could sit next to people, sitting next to people, and I'm able to hear their music through their headphones. So I just think there's a lot of exposure now that maybe we're going to see the results and impacts of that as we move forward. So what's required of us when we think about our occupational noise exposures? What's required of us in our workplaces? The original OSHA occupational noise exposure standard is a performance standard, which means it left a lot of the details of your hearing conservation program up to the employer. It established a permissible exposure limit and defined what 100% noise dose was. This ended up not being specific enough, so OSHA then implemented its hearing conservation amendment. So basically, because that standard left so much up to interpretation, they developed an amendment to this. This added requirements for hearing testing, for providing multiple types of hearing protection to be able to cover a broader range of people with different ears and just different. Now we know that some people have different size canals, different abilities to wear different hearing protectors. It requires training on hazards and protection, and also a lot of requirements for record keeping. Of course, with all of our regulations, there comes a lot of record keeping. So I don't believe that this list is exhaustive, but this is what I wanted to talk about when I'm talking about we all know that noise is dangerous. So, why is it still a problem? Because we see now that it is. So these are some of the main things I believe are keeping us as safety professionals or hearing conservationists from seeing more progress in the reduction of our work-related noise-induced hearing loss. And we're going to kind of go through each of those one by one. So OSHA's regulation has a 5 decibel exchange rate. And however, this doesn't match with how decibels actually double when we do the math with decibels. Also, according to OSHA, if an employee is exposed at that 90 decibels for 8 hours, then they're receiving a 100% noise dose. However, the CDC has reported that at that level, so at a 90 decibel exposure level over 8 hours, damage is still seen in a quarter of those people who are exposed. With a reduction in this limit to 85 decibels for 8 hours, this amount of reported individuals seeing hearing loss drops to less than 10%. This introduces part of the benefit of being able to kind of monitor different channels on your instrumentation. We'll roll into some instrumentation stuff later, but this allows you to test out a more conservative and technically more accurate regulatory way of looking at your noise. The formulas for evaluating noise dose and evaluate the difference. This can help you, of course, better protect your employees, but it also might lead to you being able to have a little more justification for why you want to drop those levels and a better understanding of your noise exposures in general and what this difference makes, right? But so the 90 decibel permissible exposure limit with the 5 decibel exchange rate may not seem that drastic from what I just mentioned, the 85-3 model, but these differences very quickly become pronounced. Here we see that the allowable time of 8 hours at those respective criterion levels, action levels, and it doesn't maybe look like it's going to get too crazy. But as you move just one branch away, one away from that level, especially as the sound goes up, that difference is really going to start to become more pronounced, because basically now with just one more click down on the Osha side, you're going to have to go 4 clicks down on this Niosh Acgih scale with the recommended 85.3. So meaning on the Osha scale, you're going to be allowed to have 2 hours of exposure at that 100 decibel level. And on the Niosh Acgih scale, it would only allow 15 minutes of exposure at that sound level, at the 100 decibel sound level. So you can see that it really does become much more restrictive in the amounts of time you can spend exposed to these higher sound levels. And therefore, you might have increased damage because, as we said, we know that that plays a role. That's become pretty well communicated, that as you get more exposure, especially with continuous noise at these higher levels, that impacts the damage that you'll see in different groups of people. So when you simply meet the standard, 1 out of every 4 of your people is going to be exposed, or one in every 4 of the people who are exposed to that will still receive permanent damage to their hearing. So this was my first point about meeting the standard instead of beating the standard, right? So when we exceed the standard, we beat that standard, it's not perfect, but we see some vast improvement. It also doesn't have to stop here. We're not held to only going this far. I know places that have reduced their permissible exposure limit down to 80, that criterion level, and it's not impossible. And this easy change, or this is a change that's easy to implement, right? You customize the settings on your equipment, you make some policy rewrites, but it's not necessarily, or even normally, simple to reduce all of your existing exposure sources. And so that's something I kind of want to talk about a little bit later, is what can we do about that? So the good news is that there is highly sophisticated equipment that can help you. Typically, the first step in the implementation of your hearing conservation program, or an improvement to your existing hearing conservation program, is to know what your noise levels are. Depending on your situation at your facility, this can be as quick as spot checking some of your loudest spaces, or as involved as noise mapping your entire facility. And this may be something that is feasible right now or may not, depending on your situation in COVID times. But so as I mentioned earlier, one of the best things you can do is evaluate the impact of a change that you may be considering making. This example lists the changes between what I mentioned, the original OSHA standard and then the Hearing Conservation Amendment. These are commonly preloaded options on any sound monitoring equipment that you may have or be interested in looking at. And evaluating a new model might be a good way to justify making that change to a model you might be considering, whether it's the 85.3 or you're looking at exceeding even that. So there are settings for Niosh and Acgih typically available on a lot of monitoring equipment, and also the ability to customize your own facility's criteria, wherever you might see the most benefit, or how low can you go. I don't want to bog us down, because I'm sure we're getting quite a bit of that just in our daily lives, any more than I need to with all the thoughts of COVID. But it's important to recognize that currently our exposure to other people is our risk, right? Personal noise dosimetry is going to require more planning when it comes to limiting that exposure, the exposure to other people. So, because that monitoring is meant to take place in that respective person's hearing zone, on their person. So for this reason, this may be a good time to focus on some area monitoring. Taking your time with this has a lot of different aspects. You need to just plan. What processes aren't running right now? Are there any new processes? Some facilities have gone from manufacturing one thing to manufacturing something that can aid us in the pandemic. Which areas have less people now? And how heavily do these factors impact the noise creation or exposure? How many of those processes do you plan on re-implementing? You don't want to focus any energy on reducing noise in any sort of area that no one enters, nor do you want to make decisions based on noise exposure without considering some sort of large noise contribution or noise contributing aspect, right? Whether that be machines or people. So focus energy right now on engineering controls. Find your loudest machine or process and throw some energy at that if you have the ability to do that right now. These are just some things these are just my personal takes on what you can do during some of the COVID times.
Dr. Lynch, do you have time for a quick question?
I do.
We have someone asking if you know anything about if OSHA is considering lowering thresholds to align with Niosh.
I hear over and over again that they are considering that, and yet I have not seen anything to indicate that that change is somehow imminent. So my best thing is that I know that a lot of people are lobbying for that. I'm a member of AIHA, and I know that they have a group that focuses on that. So I know that there's a lot of energy being put into having those dropped, but I have not seen any evidence that it's going to be quick. We all know with our OSHA regulations that it can always take a lot of time, unfortunately.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So when we look at doing a noise survey, when we're talking about area monitoring, location is everything. Make sure to consider things like reflection off of yourself. If you're holding the equipment and you're considering doing more of a noise mapping type survey, and then think about vibration off of surfaces if you're considering setting your equipment out and allowing it to run for a certain amount of time if that's the type of measurements you need. And vibration off of surfaces can mean anything from a wall that's nearby to, make sure you're not setting your equipment on something that's vibrating, because that can impact your noise recording. So also remember the purpose of whatever measurements you're making, and only measure where or what is practical. For instance, if you're concerned about the noise levels in an area where people are working, there's maybe not necessarily a need to measure behind the equipment where no one works. But if you're focused on an engineering control for that purpose, then maybe you do need to measure on the backside of the equipment. It's just what's practical for you and your situation.
Dr. Lynch, do you know if or have any insight into if OSHA is going to be changing their age calculation because it doesn't take into consideration older workers?
I don't know about that. The last time I took my update for my hearing conservation, I don't recall that being said that they were considering that, but I know that it's recommended if you're just as like a best practice that you should consider age and what's happening. So
okay. Yeah, we can look further into that and get
I
back
will
to
actually
you.
look
That's
into
great.
that and try to work it.
Okay, thank you.
I feel like I should know that. So this is by no means everything when we talk about how to perform a noise survey, and a lot of it is intuitive. However, for the first several noise surveys you do, I highly recommend a checklist. This is going to be in addition to the information that you're going to need to collect as part of record keeping, which you should be able to find some checklists for that. There are a lot of resources available, but make sure you check your batteries, make sure you calibrate your equipment before you're out on the floor. I've had plenty of times where, unfortunately, I've had both experiences, right, where I've gone to the floor and I didn't calibrate, so I've got to go back to my office, calibrate the equipment, take it back out. And I've had the worst case scenario happen where, we didn't have good communication, go out, someone has set the equipment, I go, we're picking it up. So it's now been however many hours, you come back and no one did the pre-cal. So you got a pre-cal, got a post-cal. Make sure that you're just tracking all of these things, especially if you're having to utilize different people in that process. This is actually a thing we'll touch on a lot later too. So if we ever, get back to normal, personal noise dosimetry is the best way to evaluate an individual's exposure. And as we look forward, this is going to be an excellent way to check any improvements that you may have made from the employee exposure side. Instead of just being able to spot check for that area, you're going to see if any changes maybe you are able to implement during this area monitoring time. then you can see if that's actually reduced these employees' exposure in the area, which you would of course hope it would. So these are some of the most common reasons I've seen for getting inaccurate data. I just wanted to share this basically from my own lessons learned, right? So the meter is either placed on a piece of vibrating equipment or next to another machine that is reflecting noise. Your dosimeter is placed under a collar, or it gets too close to the employee's face where a beard can rub it. An employee either intentionally or unintentionally impacts your results. I've had things like a music teacher place her dosimeter away from the music because she thought it would cause interference somehow. I've had a guy turn up his music in his car on his lunch break. You'll catch people whistling or yelling into a meter or into their dosimeter. Sometimes they might think it's, especially with the dosimeter, they might think it's recording them. So you really want to be clear about involving your employees in what exactly you're doing and what the equipment is capable of, so that they don't think they can just talk to you right then and you're somehow going to hear what they're saying. Sometimes a person may not be actually working in the area where they typically would. So you want to think about lower or higher noise levels. I've had, perform some personal noise dosimetry, and it was supposed to be for people who would be in a helicopter maintenance area, but it turned out that that day was one of their more admin focused days. So that really impacted those noise exposure, and whether the gentleman I was coordinating with did that intentionally or not, I don't know. But those are sort of things that you want to look out for. Sometimes you might get threshold distortion. And that can happen when your noise levels are kind of hovering right around that threshold, and it's going to cause the dose and your time-weighted average to be low. Your wind screens for your equipment should always be in place, but occasionally if wind exceeds 12 miles per hour, it's going to cause more sound energy to be picked up than was actually present. So it's just something you want to think about. And then battery and cal, again, goes without saying that they're such a major culprit. You got to check your batteries, have an extra set, make sure you charge your equipment, always have an extra dosimeter, just in case one, goes on the fritz, and always calibrate. Pre and post. So by setting out to identify your noise sources in this sort of like aim to exceed the standard, you can rank them and make attempts at addressing them. This is a list that's according to the Canadian Center for Occupational Safety and Health. These are their steps that they say must be taken in order to effectively and efficiently control your noise in your workplace. This was just a list that to me put it most simply while kind of touching on the high notes. When we send out that presentation in a few days, I'll of course include the link to this resource also. But they do have a lot of good stuff. I find all of these regulations to be a little bit like religious texts, where whenever you go in, depending on what you're looking for, that might affect what you find, reading them over and over again. So I want to just talk about what our next one is. So many places still have employees in hearing protection in their PPE, but that really does create more problems. So this is what I see as the next significant roadblock in reducing work-related noise-induced hearing loss. We're just too quick to control noise exposure by reducing it with hearing protectors. This over-reliance on personal protective equipment places the burden on the employee. The noise is still there, right? When you use PPE, all of the noise exposure is still there. So there might be communication problems. This picture is a perfect example. If you go out on your floor and you're seeing your employees remove their personal protective equipment to talk to each other, you have a problem, right? And whether that needs to be addressed with better risk communication or a change altogether, these engineering controls you might be able to put in place, that's just something you need to look. But so you might have those communication problems, or if the hearing protector used, it might not be adequate for the area. It can be incorrectly placed. I see tons of people even now who will have their earplugs in, but you can tell that it's just barely hanging on there. So that exposure is still happening, right? So exposure to noise can be reduced by eliminating the source of the noise, substituting the source with a quieter one, applying engineering modifications that we touched on, using administrative controls, and then by using personal protective equipment. PPE is really supposed to be your last resort, and it really is the least effective means of controlling the hazard. The best way to reduce any kind of noise exposure, this really goes past just noise, right, is to engineer it out at your design stage. So in terms of your equipment, always try to choose features that will reduce noise level to a minimum acceptable level, whatever that is for you. Really, to me, I see it almost more like a theory of radiation protection, right? Just keep it as low as reasonably possible, right? Get as low as you can. And in terms of new or possible replacement installation of equipment, try to select quiet equipment. That's actually now something that's a little bit more readily available. And have a procurement policy that includes that as a consideration. It's going to opt for acquiring quiet equipment. And also think about eliminating any of your design flaws, which could possibly amplify that noise, which sometimes ends up being inadvertent. So it's really good to have your safety people, your occupational health people involved in the equipment selection process so that these considerations can be made. I touched on this by mentioning you could focus efforts now during COVID times, right, on engineering controls, but that really means everything here that's engineering it up, and really even some administrative controls. That might be something you're able to focus a little bit more energy in. But put some extra thought into whether there's a noisy machine or process that you have right now that can be eliminated or substituted before you even think about enclosing it. These are all the things that could be researched or explored without increasing your risks that are going to be associated with that close contact with other people. Another focus could be maintenance. Sometimes machines have creeped up in noise production without maybe us realizing it, and maybe that noise can be reduced by some regular maintenance.
So Dr. Litch, is it true that OSHA will cite you if you do not consider other types of hazard control first before using PPE?
That is true. They can and have. I do believe that most inspectors are going to really care about whether you're making your good faith effort to comply. So I think there is a lot of consideration given to how difficult it might be. And that even includes cost considerations, right? To perform some of these hierarchy controls, the higher levels. But what I would challenge you to do is do it not simply because it is we're regulated to do so, right? We want to strive to do better than that. I would say just the citation isn't the worst part, right? People
Sure.
losing their hearing is the worst part.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So these are the 7 elements of a hearing conservation program. And when you think about just this, the fact that there are 7 elements of a hearing conservation program, it's just so many different aspects. And this is what leads me to what I would call our third barrier. It's a lack of clarity on who is responsible for which parts, and ironing out communication between and amongst all these different players. You've got audiometric testing or fit testing, which may be covered by either in-house occupational health professionals or outside contractors. The surveying may fall under industrial hygiene. PPE selection could be part of your safety department. Engineering controls may be something that you have to include the engineering department on, right? The list really does go on and on. So the best thing you can do is make that list and track it. You want to list out these 7 elements that are of a good hearing conservation program, identify all of the key items that fall under each category as it pertains to your facility and your program, and assign a responsible person. You can meet virtually or by phone, check in by email regularly, see how these tasks are progressing, and hold each other accountable while also giving grace, seeing as we are clearly in the apocalypse, right? So this is the list that I have. So our first step is going to be measure. Accurate measurement of exposure is essential. This is a list that was developed by Lori Wells. I haven't had the pleasure of implementing it, but at the very least, it is a resource that I wish I had when I was running a hearing conservation program. And you can just see that the list is really exhaustive, but I doubt it's even including everything that would be relevant to yours. As far as control, you're going to control with your first 4 tiers of that hierarchy of controls that we discussed. And then if those controls aren't enough, or while you're implementing them, you're going to protect your people with appropriate hearing protectors. Then you're going to check by routinely using standardized measurement procedures to detect and record any changes that you might see. You can see that many of the tasks are going to require different personnel of varying backgrounds. Specifically for this checking section, you need an audiologist or a doctor to be the professional supervisor that's going to cover your audiometric testing. But also, as you can see, a lot of these tasks are then ultimately performed by other people. Train your employees on the effects of noise exposure and the proper use of their hearing protection. Record everything. Noise surveys, any actions you may have taken as the result of those surveys, instrument calibration, audiometric tests, any of the training, your training certificates, training records. I'll send this out to everyone with the slides. And I would just ask that as you identify any possible additions or corrections, please let me know. This is how we all grow and get better. So the last step is evaluate. This is another good step that can be performed when the other steps may be impacted by some of these COVID considerations, personnel shortages, or partial stoppages or changes in processes. You're going to evaluate the effectiveness of your program with an audit. Ask for employee feedback with an online survey. Review responsibilities and ask if that's the right person for that task and have they been effective. Look at your stock of hearing protectors and usage. Do you need everything you have and have everything you need? Has there been any improvement in any area? Are there areas that need obvious attention? Review your claims. Perform a cost analysis. These are all things that may be possible now, as many of us are in very different working situations. My last 2 barriers go hand in hand because people seem to think that a little hearing loss is basically inevitable and really not that bad, but it is bad. Negative health outcomes as a result of hearing loss are really devastating. Depression, reduced productivity, you actually have an increased risk of falls. Helen Keller famously said that her blindness was what separated her from things, but her deafness was what separated her from other people. People don't realize that by underestimating that harm, they're undervaluing the benefits. So by preventing hearing loss, we're actually contributing to a better quality of life for our people, which is just a continuous feedback loop into them giving us better productivity and more better years in the workplace. So those are all my things about what I think are most important as we try to attack the curve a little bit more. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we do. We have one more. Any guidance or recommendations for mobile operations that work in client facilities versus owned?
I don't have any, I'm so sorry, but I don't have any experience with that. So no, but I will put that question out to my organization for the Certified Occupational Hearing Conservationists, and I bet there are people who have some feedback for that.
Okay, that's great. Well, I think that is it. Do you have anything else, Dr. Lynch?
I don't. I just really appreciate all of you guys' time and really appreciate this opportunity. We participated last year, and I hope this is something that we do every year moving forward.
Absolutely. And again, to reiterate, I think we're just going to give everybody everything. So by the end of today, we'll be sending out the PowerPoint slides, both from this webinar and then from our respiratory protection webinar on Monday, as well as both of the recordings. So everybody can have everything. And then obviously we have this chat saved so we can reach out to these individuals, on a one-on-one basis if we need to provide them some more detail.
And I'll make sure that it has all the links to every resource that I use. 3M is a great resource.
Great.
There's, yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much.